Well, my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a former fellow of this college. We have a Latin term for this, namely we say quondam fellow, meaning something like has been. And I'm at present based at Brasenose College over the square, where I teach Latin, Greek and Sanskrit, and hence an interest in classical poetry, including narrative and epic. One of my favourite experiences with the word classical is that when I was in Eastern Germany many years ago, in East Berlin, I made friends with a couple of students who were slightly older than myself. I was 19 and I was about to start studying classics here. The question, what are you going to study at university? I said classic or die Klassiker or something like that. And one of them looked at me curiously and he said, I had no idea that Marx and Lenin were taken so seriously. On the table, you see many books, precious books, and water, which is also precious, but could we please keep them separate? Because the books are very, I know water is precious, but the books are, perhaps on this occasion, even more so. Keep the water off the books. Well, moving on from Marx and Lenin in a different way to Georgia. Today's Georgia and its ancient and medieval heritage. Here we are in the 65th anniversary of the recovery, in a sense, of the very person and image of the great poet Shota Rustaveli. And I've been given the honour of chairing this multilingual celebratory gathering. So on behalf of the Warden and Fellows of All Souls, and of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, and on my own personal account, a very warm welcome to all. And may I dare to say, Xiaoyan Ji, which I hope means it is good to be here.
Absolutely.
That is the sum total of my knowledge of Georgian. So we're united in our admiration of a medieval Georgian jewel, which I shall leave it to my colleague, Dr. Gomelauri, to name in its own language, and to others to name in their wonderfully varied chosen versions and tongues today. For now, let us call it in one English rendering, dressed in a tiger's fur. I've been delighted to become a little better acquainted with this work over the last few weeks. I admit that previously it was only a title to me, a kind of icon that I admired from a great distance and from a position of typically English insularity and ignorance. In preparation for today's programme, to my great interest, I've learned something more about it through the medium of 3 English translations and 1 Indian language version, about which a little more later in today's programme. For today, we are to hear extracts from the text in a rich range of translations into European and non-Indo-European languages. And in a moment, I shall be introducing Richard Ovenden, Bodleian's librarian since 2014, and in that capacity, the custodian, among countless other treasures, of many important Georgian books and manuscripts, including a significant collection of materials related to Shota Rustaveli and his epic poem. After that, I shall hand over to Dr. Gomelauri, who will have much to tell us about the author and his great poem. She will be reading to us in its original language, and then we shall hear some further introductory words from her co-organizer of this celebration, Hameem, that is to say, Muhammad Hameem bin Sheik Alaudin, present fellow of this college. Hameem is very far from a has-been, except possibly in spelling. So for the main part of our programme, we shall be given a glimpse of the extraordinary international journey that Rustaveli's poem has taken, hearing 12 translations of 1 short but powerful extract, and also some other chosen passages. I'd like to add that some decades ago, I was for 10 happy years, before moving to London and eventually back to Oxford, the curator of the Indian and South Asian collections here in our Bodleian Library. And it's a particular pleasure, indeed a very happy collegial task for me now to give you Richard Ovenden.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, distinguished guests, my name is Richard Ovenden and I'm Bodleian's librarian and the Hameem Director of University Libraries and Head of Gardens, Libraries and Museums here at the University of Oxford. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Oxford to this event, part of a series of events to celebrate the great national poet of Georgia, Shota Rustaveli. I'm so sorry that I can't be with you today in person, but it's important that the Bodleian is part of these wonderful celebrations because of our long-standing interest in, love of, and commitment to the literature, history, and culture of Georgia. That long-standing interest was developed by two extraordinary people, Oliver and Marjorie Wardrop. They were involved in Georgian affairs from the late 19th and in particular in the early 20th centuries when Oliver Wardrop was a diplomat working for the British government in Georgia. He fell in love with the country and communicated that love back to his sister Marjorie, who eventually came and travelled to Georgia to be with him. She had already learned the Georgian language and had begun to translate some of the texts that Oliver Wardrop had been bringing back to Britain in his own personal collection of manuscripts and rare books. One of those, of course, was Rustaveli's great epic poem, and she began to translate it into English before she'd actually visited Georgia. When she came to Georgia, her love of the country and the people and the culture only blossomed, and she was able to join her brother in continuing to collect manuscripts and rare books, newspapers, all kinds of materials relating to Georgian history and culture. I think of particular importance, and part of the collection that moves me greatly is Oliver Wardrop's involvement in the movement for Georgian independence in the period immediately after the Russian Revolution. We have the draft of the Declaration of Georgian Independence from 1918, and we are proud that Oliver, as High Commissioner in 1920, was responsible for Britain acknowledging Georgian independence. What then followed during the Soviet Empire meant that we could not continue to collect in the level that we had before. But now, since 1989, our Georgian collection has become increasingly important. Over the years, it's been a huge pleasure for us in the Bodleian to welcome successive Georgian ambassadors, political and diplomatic leaders from Georgia itself, as well as scholars and members of the public who've come to Oxford to enjoy, to study, and to learn from the fantastic collections that Oliver and Marjorie Wardrop gave us, and that we've been able to continue to build since then. We value the connections that we have to institutions of higher learning, libraries, archives, and other cultural bodies in Georgia, and we look forward to continue to work with them to help us build our contemporary collections of Georgian life and culture, to help us to expose the collections that we have here to everyone using the power of the internet, so that the riches that we have can be shared in Georgia and indeed to everyone interested in Georgia across the world. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be with you for this event today, but I look forward to hearing all of the great things about it and to welcoming many of you back to the Bodleian to help us to continue to care for, to build, and to celebrate the collections that Oliver and Marjorie Wardrop began all those years ago, and to continue the strong academic and cultural connections that we have to Georgia long into the future. Thank you.
Dr. Thea Gomelauri is a biblical scholar, a codicologist, public historian, and director of the Oxford Interfaith Forum. She researches biblical exegesis, comparative study of religions, reception history of the Bible, biblical manuscripts, and neglected literary and cultural treasures of marginal communities. Her current investigations focus on Georgian Jewry, that is Jewry, the world's oldest living Jewish diaspora, and on its forgotten contribution to the Jewish scribal traditions. Well, that is more or less what you can read online. On a personal note, I can add that Thea is an example to all of us in her pursuit of a scholarship that combines rigour and passion, as you will now witness.
Thank you very much. You will hear several times me today. I'm not going to present Rustaveli yet. We haven't started presentation, but this is now my opportunity. This is my special privilege to acknowledge and thank all those who contributed to our celebration of the recovery of Rustaveli's fresco. There cannot be a better way of honoring those who accomplished this mission impossible than gifting Rustaveli's literary treasure to as many linguistic and cultural communities as possible. If you have read the story of recovery of Rustaveli's fresco on the website, then you would know what I mean when I said mission impossible. But I'm not going there today. Today, we do not have a capacity to present Rustaveli in 59 languages it has been translated, but we hope to give you a taste of its richness and its wisdom transcending time and space. Our colleagues will present a beautiful tapestry of Rustaveli's poetry in 12 Western and Eastern languages. Each translation has a unique story in its historical, cultural, and literary landscape. We are not able and we do not intend to cover them all, but we hope to whet your appetite for further explorations. I want to use this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude, first of all, to all our presenters, collectively and individually to each of you. Thank you very much for making time during this busy term for this exercise and for this opportunity. I want to thank special thanks to Dr. Jonathan Katz, not only for honoring us with his linguistic and oratorical skills, but also for spending his entire summer holidays diligently studying Rustaveli in several different languages and translations, really.
Most of them were in English.
Yes. And we are grateful to the Warden and the Fellows of All Souls for their generous hospitality. Before we go into real presentations, I want to say a few words about exhibition which we put together to enhance your experience of Rustaveli. Many people work behind the scenes to bring those books and to put everything together. We have acknowledged most of them on the website. Central piece of our exhibition is unique collective manuscript, which was written over 18 years, and every page is written by different famous Georgian public figure. So please make the most to browse and to explore. Author of this idea was Dr. And now I invite you to explore this opportunity. But before we dive into the celebration of these multiple languages, I also want to thank Alexander Sherburne, who brought his own books from 3 different locations. So please treat them very carefully. And now I invite Hameem to share a few his words before we dive into the presentation. Thank you very much. And Hameem, over to you.
So
Yes.
Hameem gets 2 introductions. Hameem, before being elected an examination fellow, which used to be called a prize fellow of this college, graduated in English language and literature from New College, and then took an MA in linguistics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. His research combines philological, literary and philosophical and theological study of early English writings. But his linguistic reach is wide and deep in both East and West, and perhaps I should say North and South too.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you've already heard, I am the one with the impressively long name, Muhammad Hameem bin Sheik Alaudin. I first encountered this poem entitled, forgive me, Vepkhistqaosani, when, in the original, at least that's what it's called, when I was a teenager growing up in Singapore, long before I was acquainted with the signature ejective consonants of the Georgian language in which this very title is stressed. I knew very little about Georgia then, and would definitely have been unable to point to the country on a map, much less tell you anything about its culture, history, or politics, and could just about distinguish it from its namesake in English, the American state with a capital in Atlanta. But I loved poetry and was a keen reader, always hungry for more. And thanks to that magical portal called Wikipedia, I found out about this great poetic epic, enchantingly called The Knight in the Panther's Skin, much easier to pronounce, in one version at least. It was distinct from the titles of other epics I had come across at that point, which were often proper names or single inscrutable words in languages which failed to invoke any concrete or relatable imagery in my head, like the Iliad, Mahabharata, the Aeneid, or the Lusiad. I was familiar with idioms like wolf in a sheep's clothing, or feeling comfortable in one's own skin, but this was different and captured the imagination instantly. Who and why is this knight in a panther's skin? Does he bode ill or well? We find ourselves wandering with the protagonist Aftandil as we wander along with him around the fictive landscapes of Arabia, India, China, and Persia, among others. Ironically, some of these lands were much less foreign to me than they would have been to the author of the work, Shota Rustaveli, or his audience, since as an ethnic Tamil from Southeast Asia, travel to, say, India and China, both of which I've been to, was far more accessible to me than to Rustaveli in his time, for whom exotic geography far removed from the Caucasus served as an allegorical canvas for themes and events happening back home in Georgia. Conversely, Georgia was, for me, the fantastical locale that India must have been to Rustaveli. And yet, what brings me here today to this event is the text itself. For it is Rustaveli's language and verse that allows all of us to traverse these literal and literary worlds. As we listen to readings of Rustaveli's work in 12 European and Asian languages today, I invite you all to travel with the text and its translations, and to experience the texture of his poetry in different languages, whether you yourself have been to Georgia or any of the other destinations mentioned in the poem. We may not jump onto steeds anymore to defend chivalric friendships, loyalties, and loves across different nations like the heroes of our poem, but we have recourse to language and literature to understand one another and other cultures, to bridge divides, and to celebrate the monumental achievement of this national poet of Georgia through its many translations. This is especially important in an age when misinformation, conflict, and political instability threaten many regions worldwide. When Thea first brought up the idea of organizing an event commemorating Rustaveli with me, I was incredibly excited because this finally gave me the excuse I needed to read the poem, which I read about all those years ago on Wikipedia. And it also allowed me to find out so much more about the poem through its rich history of translation into other languages well beyond the medieval period of its composition. With my interest in poetics and my having studied some Persian before, I was utterly fascinated by the alleged Persian provenance claimed by Rustaveli for his poem, as well as the intricate shairi form chosen by him, made up of more than 1,600 16-syllable monorhymed quatrains. Moreover, even the vexed title of the work in English has a story to tell. The knight often cited in English renditions does not feature in the ungendered Georgian title, as I understand, while the identity of the beast, panther, tiger, is disputed. In some ways, it's emblematic of the country which produced it, known by exonyms such as Iberia and Georgia, both of which are homophones of the names of other territories. And does the latter have to do with the name of its patron saint, St. George, or the Persian word for a wolf, God? I hope that today's event will shed light on the richness of a culture and literature that should be more well known in the English-speaking world than it currently is. But for now, I'll let Shota Rustaveli's words speak for themselves. Thank you.
I won't do justice today if I try to explain what Rustaveli means in Georgia. And to Georgia, and this unpronounceable, almost unpronounceable word, Vepkhistqaosani. Therefore, I selected only one issue to focus, to give you bird's view on the identity, perhaps, of Georgian mentality. As Rustaveli's fresco was discovered, inscribed on a stone on a pillar, it is hugely symbolic that most ancient fragments of Rustaveli's writing survive not on parchment, but also on a stone. And this is what you see on the screen. Next to this fresco. We are going next to see what this text means and who the writers are as an introduction to reading. Now you see the full view of the text. This is attributed to the 15th century, but who wrote it and what is the text and where it is location? I want to focus on 3 points: authors, location, and the content. I'm going to show, I'm not going to read, but I'm going to show you English translation of this text. This is a letter written by Nestan Darejan, who is captured in the castle and who writes, "I am sitting in a castle so lofty that I cannot scarcely see the ground." And it ends by urging her beloved to renounce her. Say, "Renounce me with a heart harder than rock itself." This is Lynn Coffin's translation of the same verse. Now, where is this text written? This is the church, and this is inside of these walls that you see this inscription. But to appreciate the full contents, we have to zoom out and to see where it is location. So every next photo will show you the distance of the location. You see? And then? And then? Okay. Now, what is this and how did it end up there in such a remote place? It is fascinating that those words are written not by scribes, but by women who were held in this church against their will. And it is hugely comforting to know that 15th century ordinary women held captive in those remote areas. They encouraged themselves, they recited, and they wrote by memory those words on in the original file that you see on the screen. I think that tells what Rustaveli means to Georgia. We cannot go into deep discussion about this story, but I think this indicates that almost you can say that Georgia is walking Rustaveli. And just as a funny statistic, department about 10 years ago did a little survey, and the heroes' names, whether it's Avtandil, Dariel, Nestan, and Darejan separately, Fridon, Rustom, all the other names, are so popular that almost 1/3 of Georgia population bear their names. So Georgia is almost walking Vepkhistqaosani heroes. So here we are. Now, we can talk later on the many details. Now, if your loved one, somebody you care about, is captured and in prison in a remote place like this, you need all the prayers you can and all the languages you can pronounce. And we know that after this prayer was answered and they successfully rescued Nestan Darejan from captivity. Therefore, we have chosen to read, and every presenter after me will present a little context, but we will all read the same prayer that Avtandil prayed before undertaking his dangerous journey. So allow me to grab the book and read for you in Georgian Avtandil's prayer. But I want also to point out the special edition I am going to read from our exhibition. So if you allow me to stretch, yes, this is the book I want to read from. Thank you very much. And this book also sells a lot. The book was a dowry in Georgia that every bride in medieval age would have it, as a marriage gift, as a marriage. And this special edition is actually trying to restore this tradition. This wonderful book which you can explore is sort of titled, which comes also from this Love Exalts Us. This can be the title, and all the aphorisms that you can explore. The book itself is the treasure. So here we have Avtandil's prayer for you. Lotsva Avtandilisa. Ilotsavs, იტყვის მაღალო ღმერთო, ხმელთა და ცათაო. ზოგჯერ მომცემო პატიშთა, ზოგჯერ კეთილთა მზათაო. უცნაურო და უთქმელო, უფალო უფლებათაო. მომეც დათმობა სურვილთა, ფლობელო გულის თქმათაო. ღმერთო, ღმერთო გეაჯები, რომელი ჰფლობ ქვეყნად ზესა, შენ დაჰვადე მიჯნურობა, შენ აწესებ მის საწესა. მე სოფელმან მომაშორვა, უკეთესა ჩემს ამზესა, ნუ აღმოფხვრი სიყვარულსა, მისგან ჩემთვის დანათესა. ღმერთო, ღმერთო, მოწყალეო, არ ვინ მიდის შენგან კიდე, შენგან ვითხოვ შეწევნასა, რაზომცასა გზასა ვლიდე. წერთა ძლევა, ზღვათა ღელვა, ღამით მავნე გამარიდე. თუ ღადავრჩე, მსახურებდე, შენ დამსხვერპლსა შესწირდე. რა ილოცა ცხენსა შეჯდა, მალვით კარნი გაიარა, შერმადინცა დააბრუნვა, თუმცა ვამნი აიადნა. მონატირის დამკერც იცემს, საბრალომან ცრემლი ღვარა, პატრონისა ვერამჭრედლან, ყმამამ რამცა გაიხარნა.
I wonder, is it possible to have the English text of the prayer?
Yes, we have this.
Yes, that
yes.
would be. And while that's being done, let me introduce the first of our readers. Yusuf Tayara is a fellow of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, which I mentioned. He's completing, I hope I have this right, he's completing his final DPhil year in the history of science at Wolfson College under the supervision of Professor Robert Iliffe. Yusuf represents a beautiful combination of science and humanities, studying a social history of Mamluk astronomy. I hope he will not mind me telling you that he came to the UK as a Syrian refugee. Please make a note of a reference. You can read a very moving account of his and his sister's flight from Syria and their achieving of top results at school in this country and their admission to university, despite the obvious struggles with adapting to life in the UK and with family illness and threats to relatives in their former home country. See the Daily Telegraph, August the 14th, 2014, and the article by one Claire Carter. I can give you that reference later. And you may see more about his work both inside and outside the academic on the website of the Oxford Interfaith Forum. Yusuf.
Very much. Remarkable that you found that article. I thought I'd been long buried, but there you go. I'm going to launch in first and leave my introduction for the later moment. And I'll become apparent why shortly, I hope. هو الذي خلق الكون بالقدرة الربانية نفخ من السماء روحا أحيا بها الوجود وأعطانا نحن البشر ملكوت الأرض بكامل نعمها بأمره يأتي الملوك وصور كلا منهم على صورته يا إله الواحد الخالق الذي أعطى لك الجسم شكلا أعطني القوة لأتغلب على الشيطان أمنحني عاطفة عاشقين بشعور يدوم حتى الممات خفف ثقل الذنوب التي سأحملها معي إلى الآخرة. I strongly had to resist the temptation there to open these verses, which open the poem, with the traditional Islamic أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Because truth be told, if I didn't know this, I would think this was written by a 14th century Sufi poet perhaps, or a an Aryan heretic of sorts. The poem, or these verses in the Arabic, and please do tell me how well this concords with other languages, gives no indication whatsoever of a particular religious or sectarian affiliation at this very point. In fact, I'd like to draw our attention to the fourth verse, which is particularly interesting for a number of reasons. The keen listener and speaker of Hebrew, or Syriac, or Aramaic, will have perhaps recognized the word melakut, which is to say, depending on how you're going to translate that, our power over this earth, our kingship, our ownership, and of course, if you're more cosmologically inclined, one of the very many divine spheres where angels do this, that, and the other. Not to be too flippant. What is really interesting to me, though, is not so much what the word denotes in one or the other tradition, but rather, like many words used in Islamic discourse and those of various other Abrahamic faiths, it tracks one of those many points where we can actually find some kind of quite healthy and happy consilience. The notion here in the poem, and perhaps an English translation would be helpful, is a devotion to God who has granted us, humankind, the dominion of the earth with all its blessings. By his command, kings arise, and he fashioned each of them in his own image. This is translated back from the Arabic. I hope that hasn't butchered the original too vastly. Now, why I think this is especially striking and perhaps worth mentioning in these very troubled times is because what it really indicates is a sense of individual social moral responsibility, one that I think is, dare I say it, universal. And I also like that this very word exists in pretty much every single one of the more spiritually inflected, or if you like, esoteric traditions that hail originally from that part of the world and that have transcended borders since, from Spain to India and back. And so I thought it was fitting to open with these verses. But it was actually not really this, or any kind of particularly advanced knowledge of poetics, that brought me here. When Thea approached me and said, could you perhaps do an Arabic reading? I thought, my God, you're bringing a historian of science to do this? I'm going to, thankfully, I'm sure you guys didn't hear it too much, but I already butchered one or two of the words there, but that's fine. What the personal connection for me, though, was that the translator himself was, in fact, a compatriot of mine. Nizar Khalili, upon visiting Tiflis in 1966, as a scholar, in fact, of Armenian, Turkish, and French, was told that perhaps he should try his hand at translating from a language he did not know at all. Now, I'm not sure what possessed him to say yes, but he did. He went about translating from the French and the English. The process took something like 18 years, translating from French and English, speaking to Georgian scholars who could tell him that he was butchering it, and going back and reiterating it time and time again. And the way he puts it, he was just walking through the streets of Aleppo one day and bumped into a Georgian man, a young Georgian man, he tells us. And he cornered him and said, perhaps you can help me with this translation. And over the years, they developed what seems like a wonderful relationship. And increasingly, despite the political shifts at the time, 1970 was a big moment in Syrian history. Between his beginning and ending, there were at least two quite seismic shifts in the politics of the region and the country. And yet, over and across that, these scholars of languages, religions, and philosophy found common cause to bring this beautiful piece into Arabic on the 800th anniversary of the original poet's birth. And so, if you like, I'm here today partly, not just of course for Rustaveli, the reason that we're all here, but also for Nizar Khalili, who I think stands as a shining example as to what it means what the value of translating poetry and of reading culture is. It brings us together over and above and across sectarian divide, political unrest, and hardship. Now, that's perhaps enough, and I realise I've already been speaking to you for far too long. So I'll wrap up by reading to you Dua Aftandil, which I hope you can guess is Aftandil's prayer. Now, once again, as a preface, it's an interesting one to note. I would not have been able to tell that this is not written by a Muslim had I not known, or a Christian, or a Jewish Arabic speaker for that matter. The verses are quite moving in the Arabic, and also have strong echoes of the Aramaic and the Syriac versions of the Bible, as does the Quran. But without further ado, or accoutrement, Dua Aftandil. يدعو ربه ويقول يا إلهي الأعلى رب السماوات والأرض تعطي الألم أحيانا وتعطي كل الخير أحيانا أخرى لا يدركك كنهك وتجل عن الوصف يا مالك الملك أعطني الصبر على الرغبات يا مالك العواطف يا إلهي أضرع إليك أنت مالك الأرض والسماء أنت خلقت عاطفة الحب وأنت تشرع قانونه القدر يحملني بعيدا عن شمس السامية لا تقتلع الحب الذي زرعته من أجل في قلبها يا رب يا سيد الرحمة لا أعرف أحد سواك أطلب رعايتك مهما يطل بي الطريق أعذني من العدو من العاصفة ومن شيطان الليل إن أعش أكرس نفسي لخدمتك مقدما لك القربان بعدما انتهى من دعائه امتطى حصانه ومر من الأبواب خلصا وعاد شير مدين وراح المسكين يسكب الدموع ويضرب على صدره يصبخ الصغور بدمه كيف يعرف السرور فارس يبقى بعيدا كل هذا البعد عن سيده. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ayna Chrysostomides, fellow of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, is a historian of late antiquity and early Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean and the territories beyond Iran, towards Iran, and with a focus on Christian-Muslim relations. She is a lecturer in theology at Trinity College, University of Oxford, and teaches Islamic history at Queen Mary, University of London. Again, I recommend, as in many other cases, the further information that you can see on the Interfaith Forum website, and there you will be able to read about many of today's contributors. So, Dr. Ayna Chrysostomides.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Thea, for inviting me to be here, to be a part of this brilliant event. So I'm going to be reading the English, but before I do that, I would like to talk to you a little bit about two well-known translators, starting with Marjorie Wardrop, who you've heard a little bit about already. But I think it's important to sort of highlight the love that she had for Georgian, and for Georgian literature and culture. This is her in Georgian dress, which she apparently was quite fond of. And she created the first translation of The Knight in the Panther Skin into English, amongst several other translations of Georgian narratives. And she traveled around Georgia from 1894 to 1895 and 1896 and just absolutely fell in love with the country. We've already discussed how she was sister to Sir Oliver Wardrop, and there is a fund here at Oxford in her name, created by her brother for the study of Georgian language, literature, and history. We have a lot to thank her for, but I thought I'd like to show you just a little bit of the woman herself. And this is actually her personal manuscript, which Thea very generously gave me a picture of, that has flowers pressed into it. When she was making the translation, she thought to press flowers and save them as she was going along. I just think that tells you so much about a human being. But I'm not going to be reading from her translation. I'm going to be reading from an updated one by Lynn Coffin, who works at the University of Washington. She's a poet and Georgian translator. She has created a translation in 2015 for The Knight and the Panther Skin, and she has a lot to say about her translation. One of those things is that she sincerely believes that there's a great deal here of Rustaveli's spirit, and she actually goes on to talk about how she felt like he was with her while she was translating it in those darkest moments, there supporting her as she went along. And those of us who do translations of historical figures, I think we often have that moment where we feel like we're channeling someone, and she certainly had that. And of course, she also fell in love with Georgian culture and says that the Georgians are the most generous people on the planet. I love them. I love Shota Rustaveli. So we have someone very passionate who's done the translation that I'm going to be reading from today. This is just one positive review of many of this translation, so it's actually very renowned at this point. It's very well respected. Okay, so without further ado, I'm just going to quickly read Tandel's prayer, and then a little bit of what comes after his prayer, what happens after he leaves in the king's court. Great God of earth and highest heaven, Tandel fervently prayed, who punishes us sometimes lets his punishments be stayed. Unknowable, unutterable, Lord of heaven's host arrayed, O ruler of the passions, let me not by my longings be swayed. O God, I beseech you, who governs what is high and what is deep, you did create love, and you have decreed the laws that it must keep. Fate sundered me from my brightly shining sun, and has made me weep. Do not uproot the great love she has sown for me, nor let it sleep. O God, I have no one beside you, both merciful and strong. From you I beg aid while I'm on the road, no matter how long. Shelter me from foes, the tumultuous sea, the one who does wrong. If I live, I'll offer sacrifice to you. To you I'll belong. When he prayed, he mounted his horse and stealthily passed through the gate to go on this treacherous journey. He sent back Shermidin, although that servant's suffering was great. The vassal weeps and beats his breast. He's in a terrible state. How can a vassal rejoice who has watched his lord leaving of late? Now after he goes, there's a lot of mourning and tragedy in the king's court. They're not very happy that he's gone. And this is a bit of the incredibly emotive response of so many to his leaving. The sound of lamentations was heard. A great host had gathered there. A crowd of palace courtiers were trying their own beards to tear. All rend and strike themselves. The sound of their hard slapping fills the air. They say darkness is upon us, our sun is gone, and we don't know where. When the king saw his vassals, he complained to them with groans and tears. He asked them, what have we done that our sun suddenly disappears? In what have we hurt him or sinned that he has parted from his peers? Who will maintain order among the troops he led so well all these years? All wept and lamented. Then at length they grew calm and wept no more. The king asked, did he go alone or with someone forth from his door? Shermidin, fearful and shameful, could not the king's request ignore, and he gave him the testament and wept. Life seemed something he forswore. He told the king, I found this in his chamber, written by his hand. The servants stood there and tore their hair and beard. They were a weeping band. He's stolen away alone. No one rides with him across the land. I don't deserve to live. Slay me justly, cut me down where I stand. When they read the will, again they wept, their tears given a new lease. The king said, let not my troops wear bright colors, not a single piece. Let us ask the poor, the orphans and widows to pray without cease. Let us help him so God will ensure he makes his journey in peace. Thank you.
tamper with this.
I was too scared to as well.
Just back to the previous training. I am now going to read from a recently published Indian language translation, the first of two that we shall hear today. This one is in Hindi language, published in 2021 under the title Sheik Khalwala Samant Shurgir, something like The Valiant Knight in the Lion's Skin. There's an introduction in this handsomely printed and beautifully illustrated book of the illustrations by a Mumbai Maharashtrian artist, Omkar Phondekar. The book itself is on display over there, I think. And the introduction is by the Indian ambassador to Georgia, who tells us that the first mention of the epic in the Indian context was made by an Indian writer, Prabhakar Machve, in 1957. In a letter to the USSR ambassador, Machve requested the naming of a street in Delhi after Shota Rustaveli. The translation is by the Urdu and Hindi poet and translator Bhupender Aziz Parihar, and it was made not directly from the Georgian, I believe, but from a 1968 English version by the Georgian academic Sushri Vera Usadze, which I believe owed some of its style to Marjorie Scott Wardrop's 1912 English version. The project was specifically highlighted as a tribute to the centuries-old friendship between Georgia and India, especially since the epic's hero, Prince Tariel, is a prince from the fictional Seventh Kingdom of India. Yes, fictional, but romantically so. It bears actually, I have to say, as an Indianist, a little relation to the historical and geographical India that I have studied. I take that as a challenge to the imagination. It's a challenge well worth facing. I have faced it. God here is, in this Hindi translation, specifically Hindu. You will hear the words Bhagwan, the Blessed One, as in Bhagavad Gita, and Parameshvara, the Lord, the Supreme Lord. अवधानी ने भक्तिमय उत्साह के साथ प्रार्थना की। धरती और आकाश के परमपिता, कभी सजा देने वाले, कभी दया के सागर, हे भगवान, परमात्मा और सर्वशक्तिमान, जिसवा तुम्हारा महिमा का बयान नहीं कर सकती। दिलों पर राज करने वाले परम सम्राट, मुझे शक्ति दो अपनी अभिलाषा को पूरा करने की। भगवान परमेश्वर, मेरी आपसे विनती है, आप धरती और आकाश को परिचालन करने वाले हैं। आपने प्रेम का सृजन किया, इसका विधि विधान तय किया। भाग्य ने मुझे मेरे सूरज के अलग कर दिया है और उसे मेरे सामने से हटने पर मजबूर कर दिया है। हे भगवान, मेरे मन में उसने जो प्रेम को बीज पाया है, उसे अखाड़ना मत, मेरी आपसे विनती है। आपके बिना कौन है और बनेगा जो सहारा मेरा। हे दया के जनक, मेरी मदद करो, थामे रखना मुझे, चाहे सफर कितना भी लंबा क्यों न हो। आप ही हैं मेरे रक्षक, आक्रमणकारी शत्रुओं से और शैतान की बल से बचाने वाले। हे दाता, अगर मैं जीवित रहा, सर्वदा उपासना करूंगा आपकी, करूंगा सेवा। So we pass now from Indian to Persian. Once indeed, Persian for many centuries was the official language of India, Imperial India. In a wider context, though, it is perhaps Hameem's particular love, and this will be clear from his recitation and his introduction.
Persian surely has pride of place among the languages with a great influence on the development of Georgian culture and literature, and Rustaveli's epic attests to this from very early on. Firstly, Rustaveli, in his verse prologue, cites a putative Persian source. I'll read it in English first. An ancient Persian tale I took and in the Georgian tongue retold. This is from Coffin's translation. Until that time, it was an unset pearl, from hand to hand it rolled. But I transformed it for the one who is so beautiful and bold. To the one who ravished my reason, I have brought poetic gold. Whether or not such a source actually existed or was part of a literary convention employed by the poet, where the alleged Persian source confers a sense of authority on the Georgian poem, or part of a humility topos whereby Rustaveli's composition is seen as merely an act of translation from an original source, this is testament to the influence and inheritance from Persian epic poetry and literature. The name of Tariel's beloved, Nestan Darajan, attests to this too. It is from the Persian, Nist andar jahan, literally nothing in the world, but here meaning something like unlike anything in the world, or matchless. This nested Persian etymology has spawned two new female names still popular in Georgia today, as Thea alluded to earlier, Nestan and Darajan, even though these names literally split the word boundaries of the original Persian phrase, rendering it meaningless. But, as a nick, it holds. Secondly, Georgia was historically contiguous with the Persian world, even if the modern republic doesn't share an actual border with any country in which Persian is an official language. It's no surprise then that Persians in the historically Persian region of Khwarezm in Central Asia, east of today's Iran, crop up in our poem, even if not in the most complimentary light. You can see here the lines from Coffin's translation again, describing the adverse reaction of the lovers Tariel and Nestan Darajan to the latter's betrothal to the Prince of Khwarezm. We have lines like, we must make sure that this Persian prince in our court never holds sway, and I will never let India be the food on which Persians pound. But it's safe to say that Persian literature at least has held sway in the Georgian court since the medieval period, and that more recently, since the 20th century, this Georgian epic has been the food on which several Persian translators have pounced. Oops, sorry. So here, you can see here a brief translation history of Rustaveli's poem into Persian. It's interesting that no full-length translation into Persian metered verse has yet been undertaken, despite the fact that the Persian tradition is rich with meter. From at least Fatimi's work onwards, this poem is known in Persian as Palangine Push, which, like the Georgian, is a single word, which doesn't name a knight necessarily, or whoever's wearing the skin, being only a verbal participle, meaning wearing a panther skin. Today I'll be focusing on one particular translation, that of Farshid Delshad from 1998, not least because it's my birth year. Delshad dedicates his translation to the pure and noble, this is Fatimi's translation, and it's in a parallel sort of facing text edition with Georgian, but it's only a partial verse translation. Now, these are pictures from Delshad's translation, and I'll explain some of them. On the left over there, yes, we have Delshad's dedication to the pure and noble people of Georgia. And in the center, we have an epigraph, which would be instantly recognizable to any Iranian as the opening line of the national Persian epic, the Persian poem par excellence, the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, Ferdowsi's late 10th and early 11th century composition in New or Classical Persian. It says, Bename Khoda and Lejan Kherad. And not only is this a way of linking the national epics of both languages and nations, but the word pure, Pak, in his dedication to the Georgian people, also signals one important aspect of Delshad's approach to translation, which parallels Ferdowsi's project. Delshad strenuously avoids the use of Arabic vocabulary and prefers native Persian words with roots in Middle Persian, in the same way that Ferdowsi's epic is hailed for its linguistic resourcefulness, without relying on Arabic loanwords important to the language after the Islamic conquest. This will become clear from the translations themselves, which I will now read. And unlike Yusuf's point earlier about how the Arabic section could sound almost like an Islamic prayer, this is decidedly and resolutely pre-Islamic in its vocabulary, and you'll see that. So first I will read the lines about the alleged Persian source from the prologue. And apologies to abler speakers of Persian here. I'm nervous and the words are long and all very Middle Persian. من این داستان واره بس زیبیده را ز گنجگاه ایران دریافتم مرواردی پربهای و غلطان که دست به دست درگردیده و اینک در چکامه گرجی به رشته سرود خوش بنشسته است من آفرین چامه اینسان پرستایش را ز برای او سرداده ام سرود ای خوش ساخت و پرزیب زین روی واگذار تا هم او چه کامه مرا برسنجد آن کو دل و دانش را ز من به تاراج برده است. With the lines in English translation below in Coffin's as you might be able to discern, there's no rhyme, it's not really metered, it's kind of poetic prose, shall we say, or rhythmical prose. But it uses very sort of classicizing diction and again resolutely avoids Arabic vocabulary. This will become even clearer with Aftandil's prayer, which you've heard in many renditions by now, where again numerous synonyms deriving from Indo-Iranian roots are employed in addressing God. Unlike Coffin's translation, which just says God, God, God over again, you'll hear many different synonyms in Persian. آفتاندیل اینسان پرشورانه نماز گذارد بزرگ خداوندگار زمین و آبی آسمان گهی پاد افراهی تابسوز گهی سپاس و بخشایش فراشمار زبان را ما توانش سخن داد از برجاوندی و شکوه تو نیست آه پاک یزدانا و ای فراباشنده و همه توان ای فرمان فرمای دلها مرا یارشی بخش تا بر شور و خواهش خیش چیره و سرور مانم خداوندگارا پرورج ایزدا تو را در میخواهم و میخوانم تو آنکو فرمان فرای خاک و مینوی آسمانی خود مهر و عشق را پدید کردی و خود بنیان برنهادی هنجارهای آن را من اما به نیروی بوش و کجسار سرنوشت از هوربانوی خیش به دور افتادم و هم از فرهوش هستیه و بی بهره ماندم پروردگارا خاکسارانه ز تو در میخواهم مهر و عشقی که از برای من پرورده و بالیده است ز بنیاد برمفکن. Those of you who are familiar with some Arabic and Persian would have noticed that there were, in fact, some Arabic loanwords. There's ishq in there, a very popular word. And we move to the next stanza where the Zoroastrian terms Ahura Mazda and Ahriman are invoked as well. Ahur Mazdai, man ای باب پر سپاس جز تو کیست تا مرا دستیاری بنماید بر من یاوری رسان و با همه آن که گذارم بس دیرپای و درازنای است نگاهبانم باش تو اما یگانه جان پناه و آرامگه من از یورش پلشت دشمان و نیروان اهرمنی انوش خداوندگارا گر که زنده بر جای ماندم جاودانه تو را ریتایی و ستایش بخواهم داشت. Thank you very much.
Xiaoyan Ji is pursuing Syriac studies at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, which we used to call Oriental Studies, having completed Jewish studies at UCL, where her thesis examined old Uyghur adaptation of the adoration of the Magi in the context of Buddhist, Manichaean and Zoroastrian influences. I understand that she is committed to advancing public understanding of Central Asian civilizations, preserving these cultural treasures as part of humanity's shared heritage, and fostering cross-cultural understanding.
For the introduction, and many thanks for inviting me here. Now let's travel to East Asia to see how Rustaveli is received in China. There are 4 full translations in Chinese. The first version appeared in 1940s, translated by Han Shiheng and Bei Mao, based on the English translation by Marjorie Wardrop. In his introduction, Han Shiheng gave a detailed overview of Georgian history, literature, and the epics features. At that time, translation was not only literary, but also a window to understand Georgian culture. The epic's celebration for friendship and love was seen as a morally uplifting and education for young readers. Later translations, such as Tang Yuqiang in 1980s and Yan Yongxin in 2002, were based on Russian versions rather than English. So the first 3 translations are in prose style, and they do not follow the meters. In order to imitate the Rustaveli quatrains, Yan Yongxin used 16 Chinese characters for each verse, but it is also not the usual Chinese poetry style. More interestingly, there are 2 comic book adaptations. This is the first one, which is printed in 1985, and both of the comic adaptation turned the poem into black and white line drawings. Each version simplified the long epic into visual storytelling. So this is the last picture of the version, and it says, with the help of friendship and with the motivation of love, so the couples become together. We all like these happy endings. So this is another comic adaptation in 2014, and there are about 150 frames. So both of the comics emphasize the heroism and moral strength of the main character, of Thea and Tayara. So the comics highlight friendship, courage, and sacrifice, making the story easier for young audience to appreciate, and it also allows wider readership in China. So in order to give you a taste of the authentic Chinese style, I choose Tang Yuqiang's translation. It's also chapter 33 of Thea's prayer.阿夫坦基亚的祈祷，他向天呼吁，伟大的上帝，宇宙的主人，是你以应得的赏罚赐给芸芸众生，天使们的主宰，奇妙的心灵之光。我愿为永生的爱情献身，请赐给我力量。上帝，你是天地之王，请听我的呼声。你嘱咐地上的可怜居民相爱相敬。如今我独自痛苦地远离了心爱的人，让爱情之根长明，愿它的种子在心中扎根。上帝啊，仁慈的上帝，唯有你是我的支柱， 漂泊中给我庇护，战斗时给我帮助，保佑我战胜夜间的妖魔和狂风暴雨。如果我不死，我将再对你祭祀。做完祷告，武士独自走出了首都，留下十二马金一个人哀哀痛哭。他的热泪滴穿了巨石，烧烫了河沙。主人已经离去，还有什么能安慰他？ So the pursuit of love and friendship in the epic has inspired generations of Chinese people, and may we all continue to be nourished by the timeless beauty of Georgian epics. Thank you.
My colleague, Professor Neil Kenny, is a senior research fellow of this college and a fellow of the British Academy. He's a specialist in early modern French literature, that is to say, of the 16th and 17th centuries, but not only the literature itself, but its relation to thought, social structures and hierarchies and cultural history. His focus is not on French alone, but also on the wider influence and interplay of French with neighbouring cultures. Take a look, or rather please read his book, which I have had a look at, The Uses of Curiosity in Early Modern France and Germany, published in 2004, and his Death and Tenses. There's a good combination of philosophy and linguistics, of 2015. And by the way, I recommend his blog, and especially his insistence to be noted by our so-called education specialists in this country that, I quote, learning a foreign language is about more than getting by abroad. Neil.
A really warm thank you to Jonathan for that kind introduction, and to Thea for organising with Hameem this absolutely wonderful event, and also to Thea for giving me a huge amount of information about the French reception, for which I'm very, very grateful. So, from which I've learned that there have been at least 15 French editions, a very large sum, probably more. So here are some examples. Yeah, right. A partial, well, yes, first of all, it's actually a man's name, Marie-Félicité Bose, a remarkable French scholar of Georgian and Armenian, first introduced the poem in 1828 to readers of French with this partial prose translation. So these are just some examples from that long, rich French reception of the poem. 1938, the first full French translation into prose, published by Georges, who was a Georgian exile in France at the time after the Soviet invasion. And this translation he did in collaboration with a French woman, Annie Marcel-Pont. 1964, UNESCO commissioned a new translation by Sergi Tsuladze, which received a prize from the Académie Française. 1989, shortly before Georgian independence, Gaston FRHistS published a new translation with striking, as you can see, sinuous illustrations by the graphic artist, I gather, celebrated graphic artist, Rustaveli. Then she was very young at the time. The translator had a French mother and a Georgian father. And the translator was a professor of French literature in Georgia until the time of independence, and he then ended his career in a university in France. 2015, finally, an abridged French prose adaptation by Anne Guimazan. Just a couple of reflections then before I read the prayer. The first is about tenses. As one would expect in 1938, given the state of the conventions in literary French at the time. This translation by Guazava and Marcel Pont in prose uses the preterite, the often in French called the past historical or the simple past or the passé simple, as the default tense for the events in the narrative, which I gather from a conversation just before the time the session started, might roughly correspond to the, obviously not exactly the same tense system, but the predominance of past tenses, whether aorist or imperfect, or rough equivalent to those, in the original Georgian for the main events of the narrative. And very much in this French version, then setting the story in a past world. Here it is. Attendit, pria Dieu en ces termes, and so on. Il monta à cheval. So once this use of the preterite for the main narration. Whereas in the 1964 and 1989 first translations, plus the more recent 2015 abridged prose adaptation, they prefer in French the historic present. In line, I think, with broad shifts in literary conventions in France, I'm generalising a bit, but especially from the 1960s onwards, the preference often for the historic present, obviously a shift that has equivalents in English, in novels in English and so on as well, without mapping onto it exactly. So they prefer then these versions, the historic present, to try and immerse the reader in the immediacy of the scene, and building on what in this prayer the use of the direct speech already does. But here we have il prie, so in the present, and afterwards pleure and so on. So the surround framing of the direct speech is in this historic present. My second reflection, very briefly, is on meter. And the 1964 and 1989 verse translations both emulate the 16-syllable quatrains of the original. Yes, so this 1989 version occasionally uses somewhat adventurous metrical effects. I'd be interested to know whether they respond to anything in the original, such as the accord starting the sentence but right at the end of the line here. So in terms of French versification, you call this a contre-rejet, this small group of syllables isolated syntactically at the very end of a line within this broad enjambement that we're getting at the start of the testament of the will of Attendit just before the prayer. But more generally, in terms of meter, the effort to emulate the original meter stretches French versification in ways, I think, that likely to make it seem interestingly strange or interestingly strained to French readers who are used to the 12-syllable Alexandrine as normally the longest and very often the dominant line of pre-modern French poetry. So using a line longer than the Alexandrine might evoke for readers modern French poetry of the likes of Guillaume Apollinaire, Louis Aragon, who experimented with using unusually longer lines than the standard 12-syllable Alexandrine. So this modern feel then is enhanced by the enhanced by the 1964 translator, for whom the monorhyme of the original is one challenge too far, and So his solution is simply unrhymed quatrains, or occasionally a bit rhymed. That translator also demands some contortions with pronunciation to keep to the syllable count as well. As also does this 1989 translator. So when reading, I'll need to keep to the syllable count, I'll need to count cieux at the top there as one virtual syllable, which becomes two there, cieux, if you're going to skip to the syllable count, but obviously that's in tension with the rhyme there. But just to remind you, if you're doing the fun game of counting syllables, in French versification, if there's an E at the end of a word that normally wouldn't be sounded, it does get slightly sounded and count as a foot if it's followed by consonant. So met would count as two there, for example. So on the other hand, unlike the 1964 translator, this 1908 one, as you can see, does emulate the monorhyme, if with an occasionally slightly approximate approach to rhyme with sim and sem. And the overall effect, I think, for French readers, if there are any real French people, unlike me here, you can disagree with me, I'd be very interested. I think the overall effect in the poetry, as in the illustrations, is a kind of alluring combination of vague archaism, through the monorhyme, enriched by numerous other sonic effects, lots of alliteration, line two, and so on. So vague archaism with tinges of modernity. So see what you think as I read it. Il prie, disant, ô Dieu très haut, régissant la terre et les cieux, envoyant tantôt le tourment et tantôt le bien précieux, inconnaissable et ineffable, éditant les droits gracieux, maître des passions, bannis le bas désir pernicieux. Je te prie, ô Seigneur, régnant sur l'étendue ferme et les cimes, tu créas l'amour et tu fis les lois par lesquelles on s'aime. Le sort m'éloigna du soleil dont la pure clarté sème. Ne déracine point l'amour que ses rayons dans mon cœur sèment. Ô Dieu miséricordieux, je n'implore que toi, au fait. De retour des chemins lointains, pour toi seul ma prière est faite. Vain l'ennemi, l'esprit de nuit. Instaure en mer la paix parfaite. Permets que par ton serviteur, ton œuvre noble soit parfaite. Ayant prié, le preux franchit le seuil sur son cheval de race. Cher madame pleure, renvoyée, et ses joues en portent les traces. Meurtrit sa poitrine, et le sang des rigoles sur les traces. De ne point revoir son seigneur, au vassal n'est pire disgrâce.
Utsa Bose is a DPhil candidate in history at Somerville College. His present research is on the socio-cultural and medical history of the bubonic plague in Calcutta between 1890 and 1920. So, more broadly, his interests include the history of epidemics, pandemics, and endemic diseases in colonial South Asia. But among his other areas of interest are literary translation, philology, the relationship between faith, religion, health, and medicine, and these are subjects that he has taught here in Oxford and in which he has published. He is a published writer himself, and his translation of 16 short stories from the Bengali language, Folk Tales of Meghalaya, was published in 2024 by Puffin Penguin, Random House. Thank you.
For that, Professor Katz. Before I begin, I want to thank everyone here, but also especially Thea and Hameem, and also Yusuf for making me not the only historian of science and medicine. We are a strange and curious breed. I'll come back to why I call this In the Skin of a God, but I want to begin by saying that the translation that I'm reading from is the Bangla translation, but it was done in Bangladesh, so it was not done in India. It was done by Muhammad Tahirul Islam in 2022, it's quite recent. And he says in his introduction that he, quote, lost himself in the poem. I think this speaks really well with what you were saying before, the English translation of getting lost and thinking you're with the text. And the version that I'm reading from has beautiful drawings, which I'll get to in a bit. And the drawings are by Mahmudul Hassan, and he says that he took some liberties with the drawings, and it's interesting as well, and he used, quote, oil and color line lake art genres. But so what I'll do is I'll read the translation first. Yes, and I'll come back to the title in the Bangla title. So it's অফেন্ডেলের প্রার্থনা এবং তার যাত্রা। তিনি প্রার্থনা করেন এবং বলেন, পৃথিবী ও স্বর্গের মহান ঈশ্বর, যিনি মাঝে মাঝে শান্তি দেন, মাঝে মাঝে পুরস্কার দিতে প্রস্তুত থাকেন, অজ্ঞেয় এবং অনির্বাচনীয় কৃতিত্বের প্রভু, হে হৃদয় কথনের শাসক, আমাকে আন্তরিক বাসনা সহ্য করার ক্ষমতা দিন। ঈশ্বর, ঈশ্বর, আমি আপনার কাছে মিনতি করছি, যিনি গভীরতা ও উচ্চতা নিয়ন্ত্রণ করেন। আপনি ভালোবাসা সৃষ্টি করেছেন, আপনি এটির নিয়ম কানুন জারি করেছেন। এই পৃথিবী আমাকে আমার সূর্য থেকে বিচ্ছিন্ন করেছে, আমার জন্য তার বপনকৃত ভালোবাসা নির্গুণ করেনি। ঈশ্বর, দয়াশীল ঈশ্বর, আপনি ছাড়া আমার পাশে কেউ নেই। যতক্ষণ আমি ভ্রমণ করব ততক্ষণ রাস্তায় আমি আপনার সহায়তার প্রার্থনা করি। শত্রুদের আধিপত্য, সাগরের বিক্ষোভ, রাতের অশুভ আত্মা থেকে আমাকে আশ্রয় দিন। যদি আমি বেঁচে থাকি তাহলে আমি আপনার সেবা করব, আমি আপনার জন্য বলিদান দেব। প্রার্থনা শেষে তিনি তার ঘোড়ায় আরোহণ করেন এবং গোপনে প্রবেশদ্বার অতিক্রম করেন। তিনি শেরমদিনকে ফেরত পাঠান, যদিও তিনি শেরমদিন ব্যাপক বিলাপ বা হাহাকার করেছিলেন। সামন্তটি কান্না করেছিলেন এবং বুক চাপড়িয়েছিলেন, প্রস্তরের উপর তার রক্ত প্রবাহিত হয়েছিল। তার মনিবের সান্নিধ্য থেকে বঞ্চিত সামন্তটিকে কি আনন্দিত করিতে পারে। এখন আমি অন্য একটি গল্প শুরু করব। আমি পৃথক হওয়া বীরটির সঙ্গী হব। এই দিন সেখানে ক্ষুদ্র রস্তভানের জন্য কোনো শ্রোতা ছিল না। যখন সকাল হয় তখন তিনি বিষণ্ণ বদনে ঘুম থেকে ওঠেন। তিনি এমন ছিলেন যেন তিনি তার মুখ থেকে অগ্নিশিখা ঢেলে দিচ্ছেন। তিনি ওয়াজিরকে ডাকার আদেশ দেন, সেখানে তারা ভয় বিবর্ণ ওয়াজিরকে নিয়ে আসে। So the last bit of this, the bit about the wazir, is not part of the English translation of this section. It's from the next section. So I don't know if that's a misprint, but I found that interesting that the first paragraph of the king hears of his secret flight is part of prayer in the Bengali. But I want to talk a little bit, even if Professor Katz talked about, it's a Hindi translation, the word used is Parameshwar and Bhagwan. In the Bangla, it's Ishwar. And that's interesting because, like Yusuf was also saying, if I didn't know the context of this, it does read like a Hindu, chant or a prayer incantation. And the other thing is the word for prayer itself, it's prarthana, which again has particular religious connotations. So I think it speaks to us a little bit about the sort of plasticity of this prayer itself, which I found quite interesting. Let's skip this. I want to talk a little bit about the drawings. So I'll talk about drawings, then I'll talk a little bit about the tiger as well. So these are drawings, the first two on the top, these are from the Bangla version, and the artist said he took some liberties, but if you see, it's very clear that it's a tiger. In the Hindi version, which uses the word sher, which I think is interesting because it's somewhat ambiguous in some areas, it can be tiger, think of Sher Khan, but it can also be lion. But in the Hindi version, I think it looks like a leopard skin. In the Bangla version, it's a tiger. Right? And in the Bangla name of the translation is Baget Chaddobeshi Bir. So here, in Hindi, it's khal wala, so khal is actually skin, and it's talking about literal tiger skin. In Bangla, Chaddobeshi means in the guise of a tiger. So it's more metaphorical, I think, which is interesting in its own way. But the last thing I want to talk about is why the tiger skin was interesting to me. So when I was growing up, we used to see a lot of pictures of the Hindu god Shiva in tiger skin. And just before preparing for this, I was going through some of the names of Shiva, And I realized in the Linga Purana, which is one of the Puranas in text talking about Shiva, one of the names of Shiva is Vyagracharmadhara, which literally is the one who wears the tiger skin. So, and I wanted to end with this drawing, which is an 18th century Bengali drawing of Shiva. Right? And this drawing is, to me, this is also the different kind of hero in a tiger skin, but this drawing makes me think of Rustaveli's poem and the tiger skin and an artist sitting in 18th century Calcutta drawing this, or 19th century Calcutta. And it makes me think so much about the stories that travel and heroes who meet. And I think that's a good way to end it, I think. But yeah, that's one of my heroes in tiger skin. So there you go.
Yes.
Thank you, Utsa. We move to Japanese, and our gifted graduate student who's come to Oxford to study for a doctorate in German language, not represented today, unfortunately, and literature. Today she will be representing Rustaveli in her own language, and we shall leave German for another occasion. I'll be happy to read it myself, because I'm a translator from German. And I now hand you over to Ayna.
Hello everyone. Also from my side, thank you so much to Thea and Hameem for organising this spectacular event. My default actually focuses on multilingualism in contemporary Japanese, so this event feels very fitting in its own way. So there are two translations of the poem in Japanese, one published in 1955 and another in 1972. Interestingly, both were done by the same translator, Vepkhistqaosani, so I'll kind of get more into the translation history often between those two versions. Vepkhistqaosani primarily translated Russian contemporaries such as Chekhov and Gorky, and also had a separate research interest in Soviet cinema. So it's interesting that he would take this kind of job on, and I suspect that he might have worked for the Russian translation first. The earlier version, published in 1955, was written entirely in very modern, realist prose. Its syntax flows very smoothly, the tone is quite intimate and personal. The hour given passage of Afternoon's prayer is rendered more as a personal, emotional appeal and more conversational than you might expect. Accessibility then seems to have been one of the primary goals of the Kuro, the idea of bringing this poem to a broad Japanese readership through the familiar voice of modern narrative prose is achieved, you could say, by keeping the language very simple and almost catering to a younger audience as well. The language is, some of the kanji are omitted, and really bringing the readership's attention to the story itself. I, however, will be reading from the second version that was published in 1972, which I believe carries a lot more weight, and I'll get into that. After the first edition appeared in 1955, Vepkhistqaosani and his wife travelled to Georgia and were struck by how well known and well loved Rustaveli's poem was among the people that they met. Apparently they were met with a lot of gratitude for bringing that poem and a key piece of Georgian culture into Japan. And so when they were there, they promised, apparently, that Georgian friends that he would one day produce a translation that is truer to the poem's original stanzaic form of quatrains. He eventually, after almost 20 years, did complete that second version, but unfortunately passed away before he saw the book to print. So his wife, Hanako Fukura, ended up writing the afterword to the translation, where she calls it, in Japanese, Issei Ichidai no Shigoto, which is his greatest once-in-a-lifetime undertaking. And you can see that passion and dedication in that verse translation of 1972. It's intentionally stylistic and rhythmical, even though it's not metered and not rhymed. It still draws on archaic inflections and an incantatory rhythm that evokes the performance of ritual prayer. Its diction is high and quasi, almost kind of biblical and elevated, which is a stark contrast to the naturalistic and emotionally direct prose of 1955. This contrast is encapsulated, among other things, in the way that God is addressed in this passage. As many of you may know, Japanese pronouns vary significantly based on context, formality, and speaker. Both prayers begin with kami-o, which is dear God or O God, But in the prose version, God becomes the intimate anata, which is also used in everyday language, whereas the 1972 version, God is elevated to nushi, which is more like master or owner. The shift from personal address to sacred invocation marks the translator's movement from humanizing the language to resacralizing it, which I hope you'll be able to hear in the reading. Yeah. Let's start. Here we go. 彼は祈った。神よ、天と地の主よ。苦を賜り、楽を授け、知り得ず、表現し得ざる体験の主よ。我に熱情を与えたまえ、神よ、熱情の主よ。大地に君臨し、高山を支配する主に我は祈る。愛は主に作られ、主はその法則を敷きたけれど、この世は我が美しい太陽より引き離せる。我がために培わたれる愛を引きまとうことかなれ。神よ、我には主の他に何者もなし。我が旅路の続く限り、我主の加護を祈る。海の嵐から闇の悪鬼から我を守りたまえ。無事に生きながらえし上は供物備え、主を祀らん。祈り終わると彼は馬にまたがり、密かに城門をくぐってシェルマ人を後に引き返させた。家臣は泣いて斧が胸を打ち、血は岩の上にほとばしった。主を失って召使いに何の幸せがあろう。Thank you so much.
Dr. Shoni Levie-Driver is in his first year as a junior research fellow at New College, having completed his DPhil dissertation on language in Roman Caesarea Maritima, in what he apparently refers to as the other place. Israel? No. Cambridge, I think he means. He is indeed a graduate of Jesus College, there where he completed both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees before coming to this place. Using the methodology of modern sociolinguistics, he studies how different identities and languages, Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, interacted across the Roman period. Shoni.
Thank you. It is customary to speak of the revival of the Hebrew language in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But in many ways, the Hebrew language was not just revived, it was transformed from a language of Jewish religion into a language for all purposes. Writers of the time sought to transform Hebrew literature in the same way. And one of the ways they sought to do this was by making the great secular works of world literature available in Hebrew. Perhaps the key figure in this movement was someone called Xiaoyan Ji, who was born in Ukraine in 1875 and translated countless canonical texts into Hebrew from Gilgamesh to Shelley. And among these literary luminaries, he also set Rustaveli. This is how the first quatrain sounds in Tchaikovsky's translation, which follows the original meter. Sar kol ha'olam, barata b'chochcha u'verov ancha, b'chaim nafachta roach merarkia mimoacha, eretz le'adam qavata be'avigon hirsoncha, u'msichim yatzarta b'tselem u'mlachim tavnit yoncha. The reason I've only read the first quatrain and the reason I'm starting with Tchaikovsky is because he only translated the first 36 quatrains, about 2% of the poem. It was only in 1969 that a full Hebrew translation came out, that of Boris Gaponov, what's given his Hebrew name Dov Gaponov. Dov means bear. Gaponov was born in 1934 in Crimea, but grew up in the city of Kutaisi in Georgia, to which his Jewish family had fled escaping the Nazis. In Gaponov's time, there was a significant Jewish community in Kutaisi, who generally lived in harmony with their neighbours, although in the early 1950s, the local authorities attempted to take over and close the local synagogue as part of wider anti-Jewish actions following the Doctors' Plot in the Soviet Union. In response, though, the Jewish community all sat in the synagogue and vowed mass suicides if they were to touch the synagogue, and this forced the authorities to give up their plans. We do not know specifically if Gaponov was among those who sat in the synagogue, but we do know that he spent many years learning Hebrew in Georgia, first from his grandfather, who taught him Hebrew using religious texts, but after that alone. Now, in Kutaisi, Gaponov had no library of Hebrew books, he didn't even have a Hebrew dictionary, but he continued to teach himself Hebrew from what he could find, including a translation of Don Quixote and the National Israeli Radio Station. Gaponov's first language then was not Hebrew and it was not in fact Georgian, but he nevertheless decided to undertake the full translation of Rustaveli's masterpiece. After years of hard work, he sent his translation to Israel, and upon its publication in 1969, he was immediately awarded Israel's most coveted literary award, the Chernyakhovsky Prize, named after Shaul Chernyakhovsky. The Soviet Union at the time, however, prevented Jews from leaving the country in the fear that they would go to Israel and never return, and Gaponov was thus initially unable to receive his prize in person in Tel Aviv. Gaponov therefore joined up with other Zionist activists in Georgia and wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, and to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. This letter brought worldwide attention to the cause of the Jews of Georgia, but unfortunately it was only when Gaponov had become very ill that the authorities actually did give him a special permission to go to Israel, where he was flown on a stretcher, and he lived most of the short time that he had left to live in a hospital. But before his death in 1972, he was able to see the fruits of his labour. He was feted by the literary establishment for his translation, and he became a symbol of the wider fight of Soviet Jews to be allowed to leave the Soviet Union. He still retains a presence in Israeli culture. In 2021, a novel was written about his life. And although almost all the Jews of Georgia have now emigrated to Israel or elsewhere, the street on which the great synagogue of Kutaisi stands is now known as Boris Gaponov Street, and there stands a bronze statue of the man himself sitting on a bench, holding the copy of his translation of Rustaveli in his hands. So I'll end with Avtamid's prayer in Gaponov's rendering, which respects the original meter and is in a high literary Hebrew that at time recalls the Bible. And if you may allow me a very brief 20 seconds edition, something I've noticed while listening to these. Lynn Coffin, as you can see, translates the start of the third quatrain, "O God, I have no one beside you." Now, Gaponov translates this as "Rakatali badola," I have no one beside you in exile, which is of course a concept that has many resonances for Jews and possibly personally for Gaponov. So, the reading. Tfilat Avtandil, Vayisa lemor, Eloah hashalit perum vamata, hanoten li pa'am mo'ani pa'am hesed lo himakta, hanizgav minni v'da'at ve'al kol reshut amarta, hamshileni al hayetzer, כי לבב אדם הכמחת. בי אלי אשר משלת בעולם בסוכתו, ממך יצא האב ותחוק את חוקתו, וירחק עולם ממני חמתו מדוקתו, מליבי אל נא תסיח את מטע חשוקתו. בי אלי יביע חסד, רק אתה לי בעולה, רק בך נפשי חוסיה, בדרכה ומשעולה, מצרים וכתב לילה, ובים רעה חולה, אם אחיה בעבודתך במנחה ובעולה. ויצא בלט השערה אחרי שהתפלל, וישלח משם הביתה את עבדו המיילל, הפוצע את חוזהו ודמו כפים דלל, לא יזכר רבו העבד, בגלים אל יקלל.
For Russian, I invite Thea herself to tell us a little about the translation history in that language. I think we are rather limited to time, but I hope that we'll be able to hear something. And then to hand over to the Reverend Canon Hugh Wybrew, who has a deep connection with Jerusalem Orthodox churches, having spent 3 years as Dean of St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. He's the best known Anglican chaplain in the Orthodox world, served as the Anglican minister in Romania, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia during Soviet times. He's a bridge between Western, Eastern and Eastern Oriental Orthodox churches who can chant the Orthodox liturgy in Church Slavonic. He may be amused to know that 50 years ago I sang regularly in that language at Oxford's own Orthodox church in Canterbury Road.
Russian translation has a very special story, and I have a privilege to tell this story and invite then Reverend Wybrew to read the prayer. This story can be the best headline for the Faculty of Languages. Learning languages and translation can save your life, literally. And there are many translations in Russian, but we are focusing particularly on the translation of the Xiaoyan Ji. Xiaoyan Ji was intellectual, one of the founders of Tbilisi State University, and one of men of many achievements. You would all know that Stalin pursued intelligentsia. He studied, arrested intelligent, the best of the nation, and put him in prison. So Nutsubize had started translation of Vepkhistqaosani into Russian on its own. He had made few chapters and then he was arrested. Obviously charged for spying for Germany and put in a prison. Friends who care about him managed, we cannot go into details, but managed to deliver his manuscript, he started from, to the Stalin's table. Stalin, it will be fair to say, Stalin was obsessed with Rustaveli. Not only he himself studied and he had made his own translation, Rustaveli is uncrowned king of Georgia, and Stalin wanted to be Rustaveli in politics. Therefore, when this translation arrived at his desk, anonymous translation, and he read, he immediately realized, he had read all previous translations, he immediately realized it was superior. And he says, where is the translator? And the answer was, he is in your prison. You arrested him. Now we are moving back to the memoirs of the Nutsubize. One day, his prison cell opens, and there comes the guard with the paper, with the ink, and with the book, and drops it on the desk and says, translate, start working. So, from next day, his diet was changed. He was no longer fed the prisoners' food, but he was served with staff canteen. And so to speak, end of every week, his work was collected back to Stalin's desks. So Stalin personally supervised translation and edited, so we cannot go any further. Not only does translation work saved him from his life from prison, few months later, he was released under home arrest, and just to cut it and to finish with this, he not only came out of prison and saw his book published with Stalin himself being anonymous editor, he didn't want to appear on the cover, and in his memoir he says funny story that he actually met Stalin, who gave him a kiss on his forehead, and he survived that terrible experience. So with this, I invite Reverend Fagru to give us a reading. And remember, learning languages can literally save you, not from prison, but from death.
I should just add that I learnt Russian during national service. I'm old enough to have had to have done national service between school and university. Half our teachers were Russian emigres, so of course we picked up our accent from them. Many years later, in 2000, I was at a conference in Moscow, and during a bus tour of the city, when I was sitting next to someone who taught English in the State University, but we were talking Russian. At a certain moment, she said, "You have such a nice pre-revolutionary accent." So I shall be reading with my pre-revolutionary accent, which Stalin might not have approved of. Он возвал, великий Боже, Господин и Царь Вселенной, воздающий по заслугам неразумной твари бренной, повелитель горных стражей, свет души неизреченной, укрепи во мне желание послужить любви нетленной. Боже, Царь земли и неба, Ты словам моим внемли, Ты велел любить друг друга бедным жителям земли. Ныне я один страдаю от возлюбленной вдали. Не гаси любви, чтоб в сердце семена ее взошли. Боже, Боже милосердный, Ты один моя основа. Не покинь меня в сражение, не лиши в скитание крова. Защити меня от бури и от дьявола ночного. Если я в живых останусь, послужу Тебе я снова.
And though regrettably at some distance to our special guest of honor, Ambassador Zurab Abashidze, now Professor in Interdisciplinary Studies at Tbilisi State University and Editor-in-Chief of the Irakli Abashidze Scientific Board of the Georgian Encyclopedia. He'll be telling us about the international significance of the recovery of Shota Rustaveli's Fresco, and he will read the Spanish translation of our chosen passage. Ambassador Abashidze is the son of Irakli Abashidze, the head of the delegation which recovered Rustaveli's Fresco. You may read about this in Thea's splendid book, which he's given me a copy of, on the Lailashi Codex, but I shall leave it to him to educate us now.
It is a special honor and pleasure for me to greet the participants of the conference dedicated to the 65th anniversary of the Jerusalem Scientific Expedition. You will probably agree that this expedition, carried out in 1960 at the Monastery of the Cross in Jerusalem, was not merely a historical event. It was a true phenomenon. As a result of that expedition, the discovery of the fresco of Rustaveli became a symbol of the nation's spiritual revival, the protection of its cultural heritage, and the strengthening of national self-awareness. It can be said with confidence that during Soviet era, this discovery represented a reclaimed identity. The international and domestic political context of that time, when Georgia was still part of the Soviet Union, gave the expedition a special meaning. The reappearance of the Rustaveli image as that of the nation's spiritual father and the embodiment of its great talent became an act of cultural resistance and a symbol of the national idea. The return of a photographic copy of the fresco to the homeland, and this is the first copy, the original of that photo made by Alfred Berheim on the 7th November 1960, was a triumph of Georgian cultural science and gave tremendous impetus to the revival of the national spirit. I was a child then, and I vividly remember the universal joy inspired by this event. But today, 65 years later, I can say that the results of that expedition had a far deeper philosophical and psychological meaning for the Georgian nation. In particular, the discovery of Rustaveli's portrait illuminated that the unbroken link between the Georgian of the Golden Age and the modern era. It was the restoration of the bond between times. It reaffirmed the eternity of the Christian and humanistic values preached in the Knight in the Panther's Skin. Moreover, there was another important aspect: the nation's psychological state, the motivation of national pride and dignity. The return of Rustaveli's fresco had an immense psychological effect on raising national self-esteem, showing that Georgian culture holds a significant place within the world civilization. it once again demonstrated that the spiritual strength of the Georgian nation is indestructible. That is why I believe that the Jerusalem expedition represents living documentary, a psychological portrait of our nation's search for and restoration of its own identity. 65 years ago, we regained Rustaveli in this form and with this meaning, and that perhaps is the lasting lesson for the future, that historical memory is the measure of a nation's vitality. As long as we preserve and study our cultural treasure, as long as we feel our connection with the world and ideals of the knight in the panther skin, Georgia will remain an organic part of world civilization. The expedition showed and proved to us that nation's identity never dies, and it demonstrated that the immortality of the Georgian spirit is ensured by its unwavering loyalty to its values and ideals. And now, since we're going to hear Rustaveli's poem in different languages, I want to show how this great poem sounds in Spanish. This is the prayers of Aftandil, La Plegaria de Aftandil. Ruega y dice, gran Dios de las tierras y cielos, que a veces castigas y a veces listo estás para recompensar. Ignoto e inefable, Señor de señores, concédeme el soportar las pasiones. Oh, dominador de los deseos del corazón. Dios, Dios te ruego a ti, que gobiernas las profundidades y las alturas. Tú bien creaste el amor, tú has decretado su ley. El destino que me ha separado de mi óptimo sol no desarraiga el amor sembrado por ella para mí. Dios, Dios misericordioso, no tengo a nadie excepto a ti. De ti solicito apoyo en el camino, por largo que sea mi viaje, protégeme de la maestría de mis enemigos, de la turbulencia de los mares, de los males espíritus en la noche. Si sobrevivo, te serviré y a ti ofrendaré mi sacrificio. Cuando hubo rogado, montó en su caballo. Secretamente atravesó las puertas, rechazó a Shermadín. El pobre derramó lágrimas. El vasallo lloró y golpeó su pecho. Su sangre hizo estrías en las rocas. ¿Qué puede regocijar al vasallo privado de la vista de su señor? So finally, I want to join to these prayers of Aftandil my best wishes to the participants and organizers of the conference. Thank you.
Remains for me to thank Professor FRHistS and all of our contributors today, most of all to Dr. Gomelauri and Hameem for organizing this celebration. And of course, we are privileged to have been able to meet in this beautiful old Library of All Souls with the permission of the college's warden and fellows and the help of the college staff. Heartfelt thanks to all. In 2010, the Italian writer and critic Umberto Eco published a short article under the title Rustaveli, chi era costui? Rustaveli, who was that? And his central question is this: are we really able to achieve an education suitable for the globalized world when 99% of educated Europeans are unaware that for Georgians, one of the greatest poems in all literary history is Rustaveli's The Knight in the Panther's Skin? And we haven't even agreed whether in that language, with its alphabet that we cannot read, it talks about a panther's skin, or rather a tiger's, or a leopard's, possibly a lion's. Or will we continue to ask ourselves, Rustaveli, qui era costui? Well, maybe we've seen some progress, and maybe all of us here will go and tell it abroad that here is a fascinating and beautiful work of literature about which we should all know more. In fact, some decades ago, we could have read some English scholars. I should mention Professor David Lang of London University and our own legendary Maurice Bowra of Wadham College on Rustaveli. Bowra's substantial analysis is a long chapter in his 1955 book, which I did know about, but Thea brought it back to my attention, a book called Inspiration and Poetry. And he writes as follows in this long chapter about Rustaveli. It is almost impossible to say where Rustaveli found his notions. Greek Platonism was certainly one source, poetry, perhaps of Arabian origin but filtered through Persia, another. But we cannot exclude the possibility that some of his ideas were his own, and that he came to conclusions similar to those reached by poets elsewhere. He does far more than obey fashion in making love the chief theme of his poem. He has given great thought to it and combined it in a single theory. He's combined strands which may have travelled far before he picked them up in Georgia. And Lang, David Lang, whom I remember personally, in addition to more extensive studies of Georgian literature, and indeed of Rustaveli himself, there's a short prologue to a translation hardly mentioned and perhaps little regarded these days, namely the 1970s Folio Society version by Catherine Vivian, whose own lengthy but readable introduction I can strongly recommend. The translation is a prose version, in part a retelling in Vivian's own idiom, but to my eye and ear in an elegantly and fluently heroic prose style, often in the nature of poetic prose. And her verse translation of the introductory stanzas is, I think, not bettered by the other available English versions. This is my personal opinion. But I shall close our proceedings with a verse, namely verse 23 of that poem, Rustaveli's encomium of the qualities of the heroic lover. And here is the AAAA rhymed version of Lynn Coffin, but please track down the Vivian book too, if you can. A lover's aspect should be bright, like the sun under which we dwell, young and at leisure and generous, wise and prosperous as well. He should be kind and strong and witty, with eloquent tales to tell. He who falls short is no lover, but a man in a lover's shell. And I end with my second Hindi offering of the same passage. सुंदरता शोभा देती है प्रेमी को जैसे सूरज का शिखर प्रेमी को होना चाहिए युवा हो जिसके पास फुर्सत उदार धनी समझदार सहनशील बुद्धिमान वाक्पटु सबसे अधिक पराक्रम वो प्रेमी इन गुणों से हो विहीन नहीं हो सकता है एक प्रेमी सच्चा. It remains for me to thank Professor FRSE, all of our contributors, and I've said that already, and of course we're privileged to have been able to meet in this live, and now go we forth and spread the Georgian word.
Thank you.